Well, as we take a look at the weather here for the week ahead, it sounds like we might be getting some heat for many areas of the country. So, no doubt we're going to talk about that and also just kind of take a look at where things stand here as we've moved out of the month of May and now into the month of June. Joining us for our weekly weather conversation, Eric Snodgrass with Nutrient Ag Solutions. Eric, good to talk with you again, and let's set this up and talk about what we saw last week. Obviously, the active weather pattern continued, and we also got a lot of heat out west. Talk about just kind of recap things for us the last week or so.
Yeah, that question about the heat in the West is the big one. And the main reason for it is we're sitting here looking at what's been major drought recovery in the midsection of the country. And I know that there's been a few dry spots in the Corn Belt, as an example, over the last couple of weeks. But overall, we're in a much better position where we were a year ago. So when we started to see last week all the heat going west, the big question was, can it just stay there? Like, is it going to stay there? Because if it does, there'll be a lot of happy Midwest farmers. Well, I questioned it because the overall flow of the atmosphere didn't change. It was just a temporary move to pushing a ridge in the west. And what hasn't changed, and this is what's critical, is that the warm water temperatures that are currently just north of Hawaii really didn't change too much. And why I think this is so important to think through is that if we do not see a major shift in that, what is there to promote, major West Coast heat? And you say, all right, what's the point? Well, the point is simply this. If we want to have a cool, wet summer, you got to keep the heat somewhere. And it's not in the Midwest, it's out west. And that ridge is done. And now, like you said a minute ago, the heat's building back across the midsection of the country. And yeah, it's going to get hot. I think by the end of the week, most of us will be well in the 80s, if not well into the 90s. And we're going to watch storms pop on that heat across a lot of areas. And by the way, just one more thing. This past weekend, storms in the plains just continued to rip. I mean, huge hail, straight line wind damage, and more tornadoes. And we are really, we're only second behind 2011 in terms of severe weather. So, Jesse, all of that is at play. And we're working our way toward the solstice, which is about the time of year we make the call on where the rest of summer is going to go.
Well, let's look at this heat moving in here as well. And I just, the thought comes to my mind is, yes, we've seen a lot of rain and a lot of catch up for drought in many areas, but we know how quickly that, a few days sustained or a week or so sustained of 90-degree temps or more with little moisture, we know that could have an effect on things. So how concerned are you about some of this heat building into the center part of the country this week?
I'm not overly concerned, and the reason for that is where the crop is, right? In these vegetative stages, pour the heat on it. It tends to do okay, and we know that there's moisture in the soil for most of the Corn Belt, so I'm not worried about it now. But question is, like, once we get it in place, does the atmosphere want to keep it there? Some of the longer range models, like the European model, which I looked at this morning going all the way out to mid-July, it wants to anchor heat, somewhere around Kansas and every state that surrounds it. And that gets all the way over to us too. So I think there's questions as to whether or not, we're going to be able to break it back down, get some cooler days in there, or if we're just going to go into a full on summer pattern where there's lots of days in the low 90s. And, when you think about that, all right, highs in the low 90s, not a problem. But how many of those days do we see getting up above 97 or 98, especially the farther south you go? That's the real question. And it seems as though we're heading toward a hot summer.
Well, thinking about heading towards a hot summer and more, I mean, that's obviously something that the markets will watch, et cetera, and traders and farmers will be watching here. Overall, anything else you're kind of seeing with any long-range data that you could point to here today?
Yeah, so we did get at the end of last week new model data from a suite of models called the NMME, the National Multi-Model Ensemble. And interestingly enough, they still kept much of the dryness anchored in the west. When I say west, I'm talking about Western Plains and like to the Great Continental Divide. That's summer, not now, but summer. The new change, though, in the NMME is that it tried to drop in some drier air into the Western Corn Belt in the upper Midwest. Really not like Wisconsin, Michigan, but more Minnesota and the Eastern Dakotas. So the question will be if that, is that really right? Or is it over attributing too much of the flow to La Nina, which is not even really happening yet? I mean, we got the cooler ocean temperatures, but we're not getting any action out of La Nina. So I'll just be honest with you, Jesse. There's a lot that's sitting here waiting to pivot. We won't know what it's fully going to do till we get into the full summer pattern, which we're trying to do over the next 10 to 20 days. And the reality is, and I think you'd agree with me, the markets are sitting here going, wait a minute, all this spring rain, U.S. drought area to 12%. You gotta prove to me that there's a problem with this crop before I start to move in any sort of a positive direction. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think that right now the markets just, they don't necessarily care too much about heat building in here. They need a sustained type of story somewhere for a long period of time. And I think we saw that to a degree in, for instance, the Black Sea region for wheat, but even that story has kind of faded here as of late, Eric.
Yeah. I mean, it's still hot there. But the forecast started to show a little bit more thunderstorm activity. And if there's a problem in the Black Sea, I imagine that it'll hit the markets like with a sledgehammer if it does. What I mean by that is there'll be these problems that, guys like you and I will be talking about. Then all of a sudden a report will come out or something will get said on their national news and it'll just light a fire in the market and it'll go. And if that never happens, then it's as though there was never stress at all in the Russian wheat belt, Western Russia getting over toward Ukraine. And it's just the way it is. But I'll tell you, it's hot there now, and it has been very dry. And when it's stormed, it's one of those situations where huge storm, big hail, they've even had tornadoes over there. And then you follow with the week 20 degrees above average in winds. And so you don't get to use that moisture. So I still think there's an issue in Russia that is not being given enough attention.
I would agree with that. Other issues around the world as well. South America, of course, we continue to keep our eyes there as we're working that safrinha crop to maturity in Brazil, for instance. Any notes for you on South America's weather this week?
Yeah, temps are way up for this point in fall for them. Very, very warm. And it's looking wet again in southern Brazil, down in Rio Grande do Sul and parts of Argentina. So it might be a little bit of a slowdown there for some harvest efforts. But, in the next 3 weeks, we'll know about the size of this safrinha crop, which did, again, endure the monsoon shutting down about 3 weeks early. I mean, it was just down early, and we're waiting to see what that means for those crops. Elsewhere around the world, there is an interesting thing happening in China. They have a front called the Meiyu front. It runs west to east, and right now it's moving over the Yangtze River. And the Yangtze River Valley throughout much of spring had a lot of flooding on it. So there'll be questions as to whether or not that monsoonal feature ends up driving a lot of really wet weather in that area and possibly causing some, newsworthy flood events coming out of that part of China. So a lot of things going on around the world. We got to keep watching.
Very, very true. Very true. Anything else you would mention for us here as we wrap up our conversation this week, Eric?
Yeah, I would just tell folks to be aware of too much of a narrative about La Nina this summer. A lot of people are going to be doing a lot of attribution to everything they see to La Nina. And honestly, it's playing second fiddle to other stuff. I think the last thing I would just mention is we've got a lot of rain coming into Florida. And Florida's been extremely dry for a while. And that's a big surge of tropical moisture that I think needs to be watched carefully in these coming days. I mean, we might get 10 to 12 inches of rain in southern Florida after 2 months of drought. It's going to be nuts.
Definitely a lot to keep an eye on. I know folks can sign up for your weekly weather newsletter and check out the latest forecast data online, agweather.com, ag-wx.com for more information. Eric Snodgrass with Nutrien Ag Solutions. Always good to talk with you, Eric. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, you too, Jesse. Thanks.